Well, welcome everyone. I'm Sam Chandan, and I am just delighted to welcome you all to this RICS World Built Environment Forum Week panel on affordable net zero housing in the world's urban megacities. Across virtually all of the world's major cities, housing affordability is a central issue, and in many cases, it's an outright crisis, one that has been significantly exacerbated during the pandemic and in the inflationary period that has followed over the course of the last year. The impact of unaffordability is much larger than just a housing issue. It's felt across a range of household outcomes, including socioeconomic mobility, public health outcomes, and even impacts on the competitiveness of cities in attracting both people and employers. There are long-term structural headwinds to addressing affordability in housing, and that is part of why cities around the world really struggle with these issues. But there are also more recent challenges that we face. These include rising consumer prices that have severely impacted the most income-constrained households in cities around the world. There are also higher home financing costs, which are making it more challenging for people that might otherwise be at a point in their household's life cycle where they become homeowners for the first time, constraining them in a way that they have remained and will remain for the foreseeable future in the renting pool, driving stronger demand for rentals in, again, a supply constrained environment. And of course, we have the rising cost of construction and the limited availability, particularly now, of construction financing, which is constraining the outlook for new inventory in the housing market. Even as we grapple with these issues that are fairly specific to affordability, our mandate, importantly, has expanded to include housing that is not only affordable, but that is also responsive to our climate goals as an industry and a profession. And that's what we're here today to really discuss. I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists, and then we will move into about 30 minutes of discussion, followed by a period of Q&A. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and what I'd ask is that folks who are participating, we're eager to hear your questions as well. And so please don't hesitate, whether it's in the first few minutes of our dialogue or a little bit later on, please bring your questions to the table, and we will weave those in to our conversation, or in some cases, save them right until the end. I couldn't have come up with a more extraordinary group of panelists for this discussion. First, Cristina Gamboa is the CEO of the World Green Building Council. Based in the UK, Cristina leads the world's largest network of organizations accelerating sustainable built environments for everyone, everywhere. She is a leading voice within the Building to COP coalition. She continues to play a pivotal role in championing the built environment as a priority climate change and sustainability solution. She's also an economist with a leadership record in sustainability, policy, and multi-stakeholder partnerships. She's a trusted advisor and a convener for international platforms such as the World Economic Forum and the UN climate change conferences. I am so pleased to welcome our 141st president at RICS, Anne Gray. Anne became president just this month in January 2023. She acts as a key ambassador responsible for driving thought leadership across the profession, helping to deliver RICS's goal of creating positive social impact in the built environment. Alongside her RICS role, Anne is a real estate broker and licensed architect in LA, California, though she happens to be in London this week. In her capacity as a real estate advisor, she brings over 25 years of experience in her professional leadership role. Finally, Prashant Kapoor, or Prash, Chief of Green Buildings and Cities at the World Bank's IFC Climate Business Group. Prashant is a passionate advocate for sustainable solutions that align the interests of businesses, financial institutions, governments, and civil society. He is the creator of EDGE, which stands for Excellence in Design for Greater Efficiencies, and that encompasses both free software, a green building standard, and an international green building certification system. More than 50 million square meters of floor space has been EDGE certified globally, principally in emerging markets. Prashant is currently leading the APEX Green Cities program that supports cities' transition to low carbon and resource efficient growth pathways. Under his leadership, IFC has created a green built environment portfolio that totals more than $8 billion US, both directly and through financial intermediaries. And we'll hear more about both EDGE and APEX during our conversation. to kick us off, and can you set the stage for us? There are folks who are listening in on today's conversation who are going to have questions for us, for whom the nexus of affordability and sustainability are what they focus on every day. But there are also folks for whom these topics may be relatively new. Can you tell us a little bit about, in the context of housing, what we mean when we talk about both affordable and net zero?
Sure. Thank you, Sam, for having me. So two concepts. So affordability is a really tricky thing to define. It has to do with the local market, what are income levels locally, and then what are the housing costs locally. So the idea is to try to keep the cost of the housing somehow commensurate with local markets. And what that means is a great deal of confusion over how you define affordability. And there are think tanks gathering data, and there are governments gathering data, and it's even between the UK and the United States, the areas I know the best. It's kind of a grab bag of regulations trying to customize the concept of affordability for the local markets. As a general rule in the UK, anything that rents for about 80% of market is considered affordable. In the United States, the rule of thumb is that your housing cost should not exceed 30% of your gross income. So in that situation, they like to peg the cost of housing to be between there's very, very low, and then there's all the way, and then there's low, and then there's moderate. And so there's a range of income. So 30% of some percent of what the local median income is how they define it. And then the affordability, of course, has to be restricted by covenant for rental properties or in perpetuity in a deed on owned properties, and those have to be enforced and managed by a combination of the developer and the government. So affordability is, it's a little bit hard to pin down, but I think as a general rule, we're all coming up with roughly the same numbers on that. Now, net zero, for people that aren't familiar with it, is carbon dioxide is considered one of the greenhouse gases, and because of that, it's one that absorbs radiation and it prevents heat from escaping the atmosphere. So high amounts of CO2 in our atmosphere store heat, and that's what's disrupting weather patterns. And that's why carbon dioxide is so crucial. We've actually got I don't know if everybody remembers, a while ago, there was the fluorocarbons were the big greenhouse gas that was destroying the ozone layer. And we've actually, through global accords, gotten a pretty good handle on that. But CO2 is our real problem right now. So net zero CO2 is a target where we completely negate the generation of carbon dioxide through our building environment. 40% of carbon dioxide emissions in the world are generated from the built environment. About half of them are from the process of construction itself, and then half of them are generated through the operation of the building using electricity and heating and cooling and all the things that go into running a building. So to the extent that we can get a handle on a net zero, that would have an enormous impact on the amount of carbon that's entering our atmosphere right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I want to ask you, so often our ICS is sort of at the forefront of the conversation and saying, listen, these are issues that are of critical importance to us on a going forward basis, and that need to become part of the more popular and policy dialogue. Where you're based in California, where we face some of the most significant affordability challenges in the country, and where purely by virtue of scale, we also produce so much of the carbon footprint of the country. Is it the case that when we're talking about housing affordability, at that local level, that issues around the carbon profile of the properties around our move to net zero, has that entered into and become part of the affordable housing dialogue in a substantive way?
Well, I don't know, Cristina might disagree with me on this, but I feel like new construction and net zero are actually more or less solved. I think in the next 20 years, I don't think net zero is even going to be a challenge in new construction. We've got, there are so many amazing new materials that are actually absorbing carbon, or, net neutral, new kinds of concrete that are being built, and amazing, energy saving systems. Renewable sources of energy to power the homes. I feel like in new construction, and then the idea of there's the lowering the cost of new construction through modular construction. I feel like new construction, in a sense, is actually kind of not the problem. Architects and engineers, and everybody's all over net zero new construction. But when you think about what actually is our affordable housing stock and why is it affordable, it's because it's existing and it's substandard. And that, in my mind, is the thing that we have to solve if we're really going to talk about net zero affordable housing. How can we conquer the retrofit problem? How can we do things to homes that are affordable for the people that live there, that don't disrupt their lives while they're being done? And how can we provide creative financing mechanisms so that people can retrofit their homes and it doesn't break the bank? And what is their incentive to do it?
Yeah. So Cristina, Ann mentioned that she'd be curious to know whether or not you agreed. I'm also curious, and I suspect our listeners are as well. What do you think?
Yeah, and I also saw Prashant's eyebrows going up. I know he may have an opinion. I think, Ann, you're right. Let's say conceptually, net zero in new buildings, we are in a more of an understanding worldwide on what's the agenda. And we will need to be acting on it, right? And that's another matter, making sure that we deliver on performance and we help the industry decarbonize throughout the whole life cycle. And that's one part. But I totally agree that point of the existing housing stock, because maybe in a little bit of a perspective, when we also look at developing geographies, where we're at today in cities, we're also seeing the result. You were saying, Sam, we're seeing headwinds, structural headwinds. But in housing, we're also dealing with like a basic backlog of problems of decades of city inaction, with the very high urbanization rates we've seen in developing countries, and how to deal with the basic human right of providing not only affordable homes, now the headwinds that you were saying, sustainable, healthy, and now the most energy efficient they can be. So, because housing is fundamental to our safety, our stability, our growth as human beings, our families, our identity, our belonging, right? It's much more than that. It has a lot of potential in our climate and sustainability quest. And actually, there's an SDG that goes directly into this, and I have it here noted down in SDG 11 on cities, 11.1 states that we should by 2030, ensuring access to all for adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services, and upgrade of slums. And there I want to pause a second, because the problem is a matter of emissions, as Adam was saying also. About 17 to 20% of emissions globally are on housing, if we break it down. And then if we act on that, we help people with their bills and we help the climate. But also the other part is of the quality of that built environment. And in the problem of quality, we have a backlog of a lot of homes that right now are not fit for purpose. And they are basically, I'm trying to find here, I lost my stat, but basically it's around 1 billion people today living in slums around the world. If we do nothing, by 2050, it's going to be 2 billion people living in slums, and 1.6 billion people right now have inadequate housing. There's some stats that in Europe came around saying of the houses that are not being used, and some great ideas on how to prioritize thinking around how to retrofit them, or getting a pre-audit demolition rights, or some sort of how to use what we already have built that has a huge carbon debt to pay, how to think about affordability of the problem in developing countries, and the below the businesses, people that are in that context, and possibly how to take more of a holistic approach for better decision making for the backlog of decades, for businesses that now understand and have routes of action, but also with the empathy of bringing the finance interest of upgrading and developing all these new builds in a way that we help climate, but help families have a decent roof over our heads, because it's basically a problem of quantity and quality.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back to you in a second to weigh in on some of those ideas and proposed solutions. Also, a little bit about the work that World GBC is doing with the UN High-Level Climate Champions Campaign. Your point is very well taken on the need for thinking about housing through the adequacy and appropriateness lens. And so while we're talking today about sort of affordable net zero, I think implied in that is that we're really talking about affordable, adequate net zero housing that supports sort of that broader range of goals, including the sometimes sort of underappreciated role that housing plays in public health outcomes. So let's come back to it in a second. Since we did notice Prash wanting to jump in on this, go ahead.
Yeah, I think no, thanks, Dan. And I just wanted to, I think there are two worlds here, right? One is the kind of the developed world where, obviously the stock is more or less already built. There's a churn rate of maybe 1% that is coming along in terms of new construction, and perhaps there is space enough and technology enough to solve that. But when you look at emerging markets, right, India or China or Indonesia or any of Philippines, the growth rate there, I mean, just to give you a sense, it's predicted to almost double in stock. So most of India is not yet built. So when you consider that, this challenge of building, reasonable priced zero carbon or net zero carbon buildings is pretty difficult still, and particularly when you look at the materials aspect, right? So if you look at India's carbon emissions as such, let's say 15-20% is from the buildings, operational, but there's another 15-20% from just cement, bricks, steel, glass. Okay, just those industries itself pollute that much. So and most of that is because India is still building itself, the bridges as well, but a lot of it goes into building. So it's a challenge, but there's another added challenge where the building high density, so you don't have the solar rooftops to kind of, like they do in California. But so they're living in a different paradigm, and it's not an easy one where it perhaps is possible, but it needs a lot more sort of off-site sort of thinking around these things. And lastly, I wanted to just stress one more reality, which is that, in most of the developed countries where we see this, the economic difference between an older house and a new house is not very high. But if you look at the people moving into new developments, new projects, their range of affluence has gone up. So actually the newer construction by default have a higher amount of appliances, so the energy load and everything else is also going up. So in a sense, there is that, the increased affluence as well on top of the growth rate that adds to the whole complexity. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I do want to get a better handle on these points, in particular the one that Anne raised right off the bat, which is that we're inevitably going to have a more favorable carbon profile for anything that is built with new technology and construction processes. But it's inevitable that much of what becomes part of the affordable stock will be the older vintage assets for whom that are no longer, to use Christina's phrase, fit for purpose for the person who wants to live in sort of the newest, best located asset. So what do we really do, and what are some of the tools that are being deployed to support the private sector? I know sort of in New York, where I'm based, we have and are working to enhance access to new forms of effectively subsidized financing, what we call PACE and CPACE in the United States, that should at some point motivate lower cost and greater investment in improving the carbon profile of properties. It encounters some obstacles, but I think those are obstacles that we're all eager to address over the course of the next couple of years. Cristina, can you tell us a little bit about the World Green Building Council's work as part of the coalition that launched the UN High-Level Climate Champions Roof Over Our Heads campaign?
That's sure. Thank you. We're just getting started, but it's an issue that we thought it was very interesting under the Race to Resilience to be a part of. Basically, it is led by Slum Dwellers International from India, and they are working with a coalition of unusual partners, including us and many others that want to join. Basically, it is when we speak about housing, it becomes about who is the provider. But when we go into slums, how do we deal with that? And it is the idea of empowering women to decide what could they do for better outcomes and innovate in financial solutions. And so it's not about, thinking about slums and humanitarian aid, what can we do or what this and that. It's getting practical and creative to go directly to people and bring them more choices that are possibly more sustainable than just letting it be. Because we have, as I said, decades of inaction from cities, and this problem just continues to go on. Because how do we demarginalize those people? How can we go on without seeing those? We see those faces in and out when we go through emerging market cities. So we all have a role in how to, all the knowledge we have, we can collaborate, and through all those innovations, get those knowledge more locally available so better outcomes can come about. And it's basically, we're seeing that we're attracting financiers, designers, architects, suppliers. For example, better choices closer to when women need to make a choice on how to improve even their solution for their roof. And so I guess the message of the campaign is also in the resilience context. How can we be creative in empowering people? Because there has to be a multitude of solutions to deal with the headwinds and the structural backlog. And with billions of people like this, we have no climate goals to reach. It's just evident that we are failing as a society, and in the urban context as well. So I'm very interested in where that's going to go. And of course, in the meantime, we'll continue to work on the net zero carbon buildings commitment and other things that WBEF and champions with the business community, but making aware that we can also be empathic and be flexible on the things we put out there to help others that are in need right now and that possibly don't have access to the solutions that might be available to improve their quality of life.
It sounds like I'm seeing that we have a whole bunch of questions coming in, which is great. Folks, don't hesitate. Please make sure to put those questions in there. Before we turn to the first set, part of what I'm hearing is that in different contexts and different environments, in particular, when we're looking at sort of many of the we might refer to sort of developed or advanced economies in the West, the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Western Europe, and then many of the emerging economies that Prash described. There are, in terms of sort of what are some of the things that are most critical for us to invest in to facilitate better housing outcomes. The things that we need to prioritize may vary dramatically, right? There's no one solution to this in terms of sort of unlocking everything that we might need to do. And if I can turn to you first, and then Prash, I'll come back to you to opine more on the emerging market side of this. And when you're thinking about this in the US and UK context, where, from a policy or private sector perspective, might we focus our energies and investment to really see serious and rapid progress in addressing the nexus of affordability and sustainability?
Yeah, well, there's something that I find really, really concerning about this whole conversation of affordability, and that has to do with the underlying affordability of the land. When in California, every city is required to come up with what they call their housing element. How are they going to satisfy the housing demands in that city? But that even applies to cities like Santa Monica, that's got some of the most expensive beachfront property in the world. Beverly Hills has a housing element. How are they going to provide affordable housing in Beverly Hills? If your underlying land is considered a market rate commodity, and on top of that, you're going to build affordable housing, it does not matter how cost effective and energy efficient your new construction is, that land is going to blow it out of the water. It just simply will not be affordable. So in one sense, you can, so there are, after it's built, you can either subsidize the construction of it, or you can subsidize the operation of it. You can provide rental vouchers for people to live there more within their budget. But you have to start off somewhere, I believe, disrupting the valuation of the underlying land. And I honestly, Sam, maybe you can think about this a little bit better than I can, but I think that's just actually, to be honest, completely ruining our formulas in the United States, because we consider land a commodity.
Yeah, those are, facilitating a lower basis, because if the land is so expensive, that the affordable housing element doesn't pencil out, that we've got to start right there. Prash, go ahead, and then folks, I have a ton of questions for the panelists, but I want to make sure I'm prioritizing your questions. So we'll have Prash weigh in, and then we'll hit on audience questions right after that. Go ahead.
Just to understand, Sam, so the question is, in emerging markets, what are the issues, right? What are the main barriers?
Where do we focus our energies? Like from a policy prescription perspective, what do I need to prioritize to actually make some progress here? Okay.
So we have as you heard in the introduction, we have a sort of a four-pronged strategy to tackle, not just housing but greening of projects across the world. One is to get the policy right, as Anne mentioned, sort of getting the government side right, the incentives, the regulations, and that side of things. Working with private sector developers, and I think there's a whole plethora of in emerging markets, it gets even more spread out, right? So you have, as Cristina said, there's slums, but there's also rural aspect, which is quite different, right? In terms of housing there. Which is not that far away from the kind of informal housing. And then you have townships that are being built, and private sector gated communities that has its own dimension. And then you have the normal kind of private sector housing. And then you have, a lot of the affordable sort of segment tends to be large scale, homogeneous construction because of this issue of land cost, because they have to buy the land fast and build fast and sell fast. Otherwise, the land inflates the value, and then the prices go up as well. So there's all that.
And that comes back to a little bit of what Anne was describing. Sort of,
exactly,
it's not unique to California and New York. Yeah.
In fact, I would say, I don't know, I don't have the facts. You probably have it. Bombay per square meter of land is probably the same cost as New York. I'm just sort of making a big leap of assumption, but the demand is so high, and for that piece of land, that there is, you're almost paying really high premium costs for these things. And there's, on top of it, the market is not transparent, so you really don't know what's going on, what the real true value is, and all of this other stuff that's coming. So where we are focused is, at least on the greening side, that's where I focus, is to bring transparency, because there's a strong assumption that green buildings are very expensive, right? Actually the World GBC came up with a really good report about a decade ago that showed that people's perception was about 30% higher cost for greening. So that is where we've been focusing on, in showing them that actually it doesn't cost so much. It's probably about 2%, 3% of the construction cost. And so that's one piece that we've been focusing on. We've been focusing on, in places like Lima, in Peru, in looking at non-physical incentives, because, physical incentives means that you're taking it off somebody else's plate and giving it to the housing developers. That becomes a little controversial and probably not. So kind of looking at, FSI, sort of one extra floor, if you build green, that sort of thing, which has an effect to urban society, I don't deny it, but it's sort of looking at incentives that can push both the sort of affordability as well as the greening aspect. And then we are really, as a bank ourselves, we focus on the financing aspect. We've been, kind of working, both financing developers directly across the industry, kind of working with the mainstream guys, getting them down, into the sort of lower segment of the market, getting them comfortable with it, but also on the greening side, really pushing them to go further and further in terms of scale. So that's one aspect. And then with the banks, right? Mostly, starting with the construction finance side, it doesn't always work as well in terms of the sequencing of it. Banks tend to focus on mortgages, and there's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem there. So we kind of try to balance that. So in Cristina's country, funded about 5 banks really scale up. I mean, almost 30% of this sector. I mean, there are other issues with affordable categorization in Colombia, but that's too detailed to go into right now. But I think we've been kind of trying to get that segment to adopt the right principles into the housing front. So that's roughly where we've been focused. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's come back to this in 1 second. I want to, Prash, you've begun to speak to already one of the questions that have come in about the kinds of incentive programs that the bank may have available, either to incentivize the lending, the frontline lending institutions that it partners with, or the developers themselves. I want to hear a little bit more about that in a moment. And one of the first questions that came in, sort of it's I guess implied a little bit in the title of the panel, that most of us are on board with this idea that we tackle affordability and net zero together as sort of an issue with enormous overlap. But the question being put to us by a member of the audience is the most effective way to sort of tackle the issue as a joint one?
Well, I think yes, absolutely. My answer is yes. As I talked about before, is I think the goal of every competent professional now for new construction is net zero, whether it's an affordable project or not. And one of the things that that is key to affordability, let's talk about the existing housing stock. One of the things to remember is that the carbon that it took that was emitted for the construction of that building has already been emitted. So it already has a 50% bonus on any new construction that could be built. So the trick is to make that property more affordable for the people already living there is going to be reducing their fuel bills. And so they are absolutely hand in hand. Fuel poverty in the UK is a massive issue that the government has all kinds of special benefit programs for people that are having trouble affording their fuel. So I think for sure it in the existing housing stock, it's absolutely hand in hand.
Yeah, and a point well taken. Again, like three of the four of us just happen to be in the UK right now, but the reality of there being sort of an energy cost crisis, and the way that it is being addressed, by the government. I think many of us hope that the government's intervention in support of households outlasts the cost crisis itself, or at least gets us through the spring or summer, when some of those some of the most significant demands on the energy infrastructure have abated a little bit because it's warmer outside. Cristina, a follow-up question for you then, is a silver lining, however thin and small, of the energy cost crisis been that it's reinforced for all of us the real importance of not delaying in addressing issues around energy efficiency and sustainability?
Yes, I think it has helped, but it has also brought up debates back about the energy transition, right? Like what can we accept that we had already done with in the interim while we saw the crisis? Like the carbon, the coal mines, and things like that. And that is related to the transition in the built environment, because it has helped people understand that we need to deliver universally on quality built environment, including housing, energy efficient, as you say, to tackle the ongoing crisis. It is all interrelated, no? So I think it has helped put the issue back in the agenda back up, but we have to keep a vigilant eye, as at World GPC does, to champion the conversation on what really is the big picture and what matters. no, and not let the siloed conversations win over, and understand, as Anne was saying, this is not, it is attainable to deliver net zero and affordability, and it will help solve issues like the energy crisis that we're seeing today, if we continue to power up and electrify our buildings, including homes.
Yeah. So as a follow-up to that, one of the other questions that's come from the audience is that, given that we are talking about, countries and markets where sort of the socioeconomics, development context, is incredibly varied. One of our audience members is asking, is this conversation around the nexus of sustainability and affordability, really a luxury? And this is the words I've used, a luxury of the developed world. And I know that my next stop after this week is in India, and I'm really eager to hear from developers there about the ways in which they are thinking about the urgent need for new adequate housing, and how it is that they are incorporating in sustainable elements. And my sincere hope is that we're having a very robust conversation around the ways in which developers are prioritizing the need and the importance of net zero housing stock. But I don't know what to expect. And Cristina, Prash, maybe you can give me some advance idea of what that conversation will be.
Yeah, I think, well, maybe Prashant, you're a local there, but I would say what I think what you're going to face, Sam, is still unfortunately some pushback with the perceived, what Prashant was saying, the perception that this is harder and more costly. This industry, the built environment and building and construction, has been conservative for a long, long time. It has a lot of, let's say, slowness in adapting innovation. And emerging markets sometimes, just because of the lack of prioritization of understanding of quality housing and just solving immediate issues, there's no structural thinking. But when you bring topics as social value through the built environment to these communities, make sure that the understanding is also bought in by communities, and that politicians see that this will provide even better communities, better outcomes. And of course, the business case is strong with the finance community to continue to build to quality standards. The conversation shifts, but there has to be perseverance and focus, because let's say the perception has changed a lot, but in the buildings, in the housing space, there's still a lot of, let's say, slowness in adoption. And we need to upskill and make sure that the just transition also falls in and creating jobs that empower this vision.
Yeah. Prash, what can I expect when I arrive in India and sort of engage with developers on this conversation around how they're prioritizing the net zero piece of an urgent, affordable, and adequate housing crisis?
Right. I think on one hand, Sam, developing countries, particularly India, they understand frugality, right? So they are naturally that way. I mean, just to give you, I remember, I could never find the evidence, but there was a New York Times article that said that Mumbai alone has a cooling demand equal to 25% of US's. Just imagine if they actually meet their cooling demand, the destiny of cooling. So, if Mumbai had the same cooling load as that, right? So huge potential. So, and yet most people don't have air conditioning everywhere. If they do, they probably have it in one room. And it's not just about cost. It runs a little bit in terms of, maybe it's just a bit of lag in terms of affluence coming in. But that's one. On the other hand,
I should also suspect that there's a larger infrastructure question. In India, in many South Asian countries, we wouldn't be able to produce enough electricity to actually meet that kind of demand.
That's right. I mean, also it is expensive, right? I mean, our data, World Bank data, this one we do have evidence for. Typical bottom of the pyramid, if sort of the bottom 20%, or even like the affordable segment, can pay up to 20% of the expendable income towards utility, including fuel for transport. So if you take all of that, it's a significant part. I mean, for an average person in the West, I mean, I'm not sort of making, taking anything away from the UK's fuel crisis, fuel poverty. But typically, it's not a big thing on people's minds, right? So here it definitely is. So, but at the same time, it's broken, Sam. It's the kind of the communication is broken between people feeling that and developers building the right things and the banks financing it and the government's regulating it. So that's where it's broken. And I feel like regulations in India have been around since 2007, not implemented. No city, frankly, and maybe I'll be proven wrong, but the Green Building Code or Energy Efficiency Code has barely been implemented across. Okay? Not even for the formal sector, but and you imagine there's a large informal sector, right? So that's kind of a problem. And kind of lack of knowing what really works. And so, how much the saving is. I think our focus has been articulating that this is not just about saving the planet. If you make, the right things, intrinsically, you would have a 20% improvement in your energy bills. That's kind of the communication part, right? There's a thing in India that's called kitna deti hai, how much does it give you? So what's the mileage? That's how people buy cars. So kind of bringing that into the buildings culture has been our attempt. We haven't really succeeded in India, at least. And lastly, financing. Actually, this is the important thing, right? Most people kind of buy, not most people, not in Mumbai, but generally affordable housing tends to be 40 square meters to about maybe 60 square meters, right? Buildings, sort of flats, apartments. And for them to spend $1,000, I'm just, coming up with sort of numbers here, for them, they would rather have an extra square meter, right, than a solar hot water system. You see, for them, they're already crunched in terms of space. And they might save, but I think for them having an extra, not even a bedroom, a little bit larger bedroom or, so that's really a difficult challenge for them to really, it's a bitter pill to take. So you really have to get incentives working in India, kind of through the mortgage system or the developer finance system. And unfortunately, some of the momentum that we have on the green building side has not focused enough on carbon. In fact, it's going slightly backwards. It's getting diluted. So this has been a bit of a challenge, actually, sort of trying to get this, carbon as an important part of the rating systems that are there in the market.
Yeah. So we have just a couple of minutes left. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm going to ask in a moment for each of you to just share a closing thought. Before I do that, two things that I'd like to mention. One is, for those of you who are based in the Americas or who may be visiting New York on March 3rd, RICS and it's NYU's privilege to be collaborating this year with RICS in hosting the Americas Forum. We have an absolutely wonderful program. Anne will be joining us, which is we're very, very lucky to be able to host her in New York. So please learn a little bit more about that if you happen to be in New York or thinking about traveling to New York or looking for an excuse to visit New York in early March of this year. The other is, of course, that on all of the issues that we've discussed and so many others, that RICS is an extraordinary resource to avail yourselves of, both in terms of the skill set embedded within the members and fellows, but also information that you can glean from the reports and analysis that are done by the institution. Cristina, your closing thought, and I think we have just a little under a moment each.
Thank you. So I'm going to do a plug. In April, we're going to release a report called Sustainable Attainable Housing. So some of the things that I've been referring to are there. And I would just say, maybe to the designers that are hearing us today, you hold a lot of the handprint, of the carbon footprint. You can do much better and be creative, connect to the innovations and think about the health of people, how circularity also enables circular thinking, better materials, enables acting on carbon. And what I would say is also reach out to your local community, see who's in need, and all the great things, try to help people that are, let's say, dealing with inadequate housing, because it's an ongoing problem. And it is, as in the questions, I do believe it's a global crisis.
Prash, very briefly, go ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sure. No, I totally agree with Cristina. In terms of getting the design right is critical, because that has the lowest cost, right? And fundamentally, that's always a good thing, because your starting point is better. But beyond that, I think if you can get the financial sector to really kind of mobilize. If you can use even a bit more of that 1% that we're getting into the green, into climate finance, that could be terrific. And then the government side, it doesn't have to be about losing taxes. It's about small incremental pushes to make and facilitate this thing to happen.
And you have the final word.
Yeah, so just really quick, RICS published the 2023 sustainability report, which is quite interesting. It's a survey of practitioners to see what are the impediments to them actually being able to implement net zero programs in their work. So it's on the practice side, and it's quite interesting.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, apologies. But again, please avail yourselves of the wealth of resources that the RICS has available, and enjoy the rest of the World Built Environment Forum week. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good to see you, Cristina.
Same.
Sam.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, guys.